I'm Ivy 34, a marketing executive from Chicago, with what I thought was a picture-perfect life. I'd spent 8 years building a marriage with Ryan, my investment banker husband, complete with our luxury condo overlooking Lake Michigan. Until the night I was driving home from O'Hare in the pouring rain after cutting my New York business trip short to surprise him for our anniversary. The truck came out of nowhere. When I woke up, sort of, I was trapped in my own body, unable to move but hearing everything, including my husband and a woman I'd never met planning my funeral while I lay there in my hospital bed. Before I tell you how I went from being unconscious in a hospital bed to taking back my life, comment below where you're watching from and subscribe. If you've ever had that gut instinct, something wasn't right in your relationship. Before the accident, I had the kind of life that looked enviable from the outside. After graduating from Northwestern with a marketing degree, I'd spent the next decade climbing the corporate ladder at a prestigious Chicago firm. Starting as an entry-level coordinator, I'd worked my way up through increasingly challenging roles until landing my executive position just 6 months before the accident. The promotion had come with a substantial salary increase, a corner office with views of the Chicago skyline, and a team of 12 people reporting directly to me. It was at the celebration dinner for my first big promotion 7 years earlier that I met Ryan. The restaurant was upscale, all dim lighting and white tablecloths, and I was dining with colleagues when he approached our table. Tall, with dark hair and a confident smile, he introduced himself as an investment banker who'd overheard our celebration and wanted to buy a round of champagne for the table. My coworkers teased me mercilessly when he smoothly slipped me his business card before leaving. 3 days later, we had our first date. Ryan took me to a hidden jazz club that required a password for entry, followed by a midnight walk along the lakefront. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in everything about me. By our third date, I was completely smitten. Our courtship was a whirlwind of exclusive restaurants, weekend getaways to Michigan wine country, and surprise gifts delivered to my office. A vintage camera he remembered me mentioning I'd always wanted. First edition books by my favorite authors. He seemed to catalog every preference and interest I expressed. The proposal came exactly 1 year after we met. Ryan arranged a private dinner cruise on Lake Michigan, timing it perfectly so he could drop to one knee as the sunset turned the Chicago skyline into a golden silhouette. The diamond was stunning. 3 carats emerald cut in a platinum setting that matched the watch he'd given me for my birthday. When I said yes, crew members appeared with champagne and a violinist began playing. It was like something from a movie. We married 6 months later at the historic Chicago Cultural Center under the world's largest Tiffany glass dome. I wore a custom designer gown. We served a 5-course dinner with wine pairings to 200 guests and departed for a 3-week honeymoon touring Italy's Amalfi Coast. The wedding was featured in a local luxury lifestyle magazine. After the wedding, we moved into a stunning condominium in a high-rise building with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Ryan insisted on handling our finances. "It's what I do for a living," he'd say with a laugh when I offered to help with budgeting or bill payments. Our life together seemed charmed. Exotic vacations twice a year. A shared social circle of other successful couples. Charity galas, where we'd bid extravagantly on auction items. My closest friend through it all was Megan, my college roommate from Northwestern. When she struggled to find work after graduation, I'd helped her land a job at a prestigious art gallery. Unlike my other friendships that gradually faded as Ryan became the center of my universe, Megan and I maintained our weekly coffee dates. She was the one person with whom I still had something that was just mine, separate from my relationship with Ryan. It was during these coffee meetings that I sometimes confided my small concerns. How Ryan would occasionally check my phone while I was in the shower. The way he'd interrogate me about male colleagues. His insistence that I text him throughout the day with updates on my whereabouts. Megan would frown slightly but never criticized him directly. "Just make sure you're still Ivy," she'd say, "not just Ryan's wife." As the years passed, I noticed more concerning patterns. Ryan began coming home later and later, blaming client dinners and market fluctuations. There were unexplained charges on our credit card statements that he dismissed as business expenses. Sometimes he'd receive calls that he'd taken another room, returning with vague explanations. When I expressed concern, he'd shower me with affection and gifts for days afterward, a pattern that effectively silenced my questions. After all, everyone said we were the golden couple of our social circle. His public displays of devotion were legendary. Just last Christmas, he'd arranged for a choir to serenade me at a restaurant, presenting me with a sapphire bracelet that matched my eyes. My own career advancement meant I was working longer hours too, especially after my executive promotion. The new position came with international clients requiring occasional travel to New York and London. Ryan had been supportive of my career on the surface, but I noticed his subtle displeasure whenever I mentioned upcoming business trips. Adding to our growing distance, my mother's diagnosis with early-stage Parkinson's meant monthly weekend trips to Milwaukee to help her adjust her home for better accessibility. Ryan always had excuses not to join me: urgent work, social obligations he couldn't break, or sudden illnesses that mysteriously resolved once I returned. The week of our 8th anniversary, I was scheduled to be in New York for a major client presentation. Ryan had been particularly distant in the weeks leading up to it, and I'd found a receipt for an expensive restaurant I didn't recognize stuffed in his jacket pocket. When my New York meetings wrapped up early, I made an impulsive decision to fly home a day earlier than planned to surprise him for our anniversary. I texted Megan from the airport, asking her to keep my early return a secret. "I'm bringing home Chicago's best champagne and Ryan's favorite takeout from that Italian place he loves," I wrote. "Going to surprise him for our anniversary." Her response was delayed, which was unusual. "Call me when you land," was all she said. But in my excitement to get home and salvage our relationship with a romantic gesture, I forgot about her message. That oversight would turn out to be one of many small decisions that changed the course of my life forever. The rain was coming down in sheets as my plane touched down at O'Hare. It was late October, and an early winter storm was battering Chicago with wind-driven downpours that reduced visibility to mere feet. Most people would have called a rideshare or waited out the worst of the deluge, but I was determined to get home and surprise Ryan. The airport was chaos: delayed flights, frustrated travelers, and a line for taxis that wrapped around the terminal. I bypassed it all, heading straight to the parking garage where I'd left my Audi sedan 4 days earlier. As I navigated out of the airport complex, the windshield wipers struggled against the torrential rain, and traffic crawled along at a fraction of normal speed. I should have been frustrated by the conditions, but instead felt a strange buzzing excitement. In the passenger seat was a bottle of Ryan's favorite champagne carefully wrapped, and a bag containing containers of pasta from the Italian restaurant where we'd had our first anniversary dinner. I imagined his face when I walked through the door, the surprise, the delight. Maybe this gesture would bring back something we'd lost along the way. The traffic thinned as I turned onto the highway, allowing me to increase my speed slightly. The radio forecaster warned of flooding on low-lying roads, but my route home was mostly elevated. I was about 20 minutes from our condo when it happened. Later police reports would show that a semi-truck driver had fallen asleep at the wheel. In the driving rain, his massive vehicle drifted across 3 lanes of traffic before the driver jolted awake and overcorrected. The truck jackknifed directly in my path. I remember a blinding wall of headlights, the screech of tires on wet pavement, my instinctive jerk of the steering wheel to avoid collision, the sickening sensation of hydroplaning, losing control. The world spun in slow motion as my car slid sideways toward the concrete barrier. The impact came in stages. First, the driver's side of my car hitting the barrier, the awful sound of metal crumpling. Then the secondary collision as the truck's trailer slammed into the passenger side, sandwiching my vehicle between metal and concrete. The airbags deployed with an explosive force that felt like being punched simultaneously from multiple directions. My final clear memory is of shattered glass raining across my face, oddly beautiful, like diamonds catching the headlights. Then nothing. The next fragments are disjointed, dreamlike. Sirens wailing, the rhythmic flash of emergency lights, voices shouting urgent instructions. The metallic groan as the jaws of life pried open what remained of my car. Someone saying, female mid-30s unresponsive. I have no memory of the ambulance ride, no recollection of arriving at Chicago Memorial Hospital. The trauma team that worked to stabilize me, the emergency surgery to relieve pressure on my swelling brain, the delicate operation to repair internal bleeding. All of this exists for me only in medical records I would read months later. What I do know now is that I suffered a severe traumatic brain injury, multiple fractures to my ribs, and left leg a collapsed lung and internal bleeding that nearly claimed my life before surgeons could control it. The medical team induced a coma to give my brain time to heal from the swelling and trauma. For the first week after the accident, the doctors weren't certain I would survive. They told my husband to prepare for the worst. My parents flew in from Milwaukee and Florida, respectively, keeping vigil alongside Ryan in the ICU waiting room. It's strange to think about now, how I existed in this liminal space, neither fully present nor absent. My body was being kept alive by machines while medical professionals evaluated whether my brain would recover enough function to sustain life independently. What nobody realized, what medical science still doesn't fully understand, was that while I appeared completely unconscious, parts of my brain were still active. I existed in a state sometimes called covert consciousness, where I could hear and process information but couldn't respond in any way. I first became aware of sounds, the steady beep of heart monitors, the hiss and click of ventilators. These mechanical noises were the constant soundtrack to my strange existence. Gradually, I began to distinguish voices, though they seemed to come from far away, as if I were underwater and they were speaking from the surface. Dr. Keller, my neurologist, had a deep, measured way of speaking. Pupils equal and reactive, he would say. GCS remains at 6. No sign of spontaneous respiration. Nurse Sophie had a gentle lilt to her voice, almost musical. She would narrate her actions as she cared for me. I'm just going to check your IV now, Ivy. Then we'll get you turned to prevent pressure ulcers. Sometimes she would talk to me even when performing routine tasks, as if she believed I could hear her. It's a beautiful day outside, Ivy. The trees are starting to turn those gorgeous fall colors you see in Chicago this time of year. My mother's voice was often tearful. Please come back to us, sweetheart. We're all waiting for you. My father, typically so stoic, would sometimes read aloud from my favorite books, his voice breaking occasionally. And then there was Ryan. In those early days when others were present, his performance was flawless. The doctors say we should keep talking to you, he would say, holding my hand. They say you might be able to hear us. He'd tell visitors how devastated he was, how he couldn't imagine life without me. But when the room emptied of medical staff and family, his true nature emerged. The tender hand-holding would stop abruptly. Sometimes he'd sigh with exasperation, or I'd hear the sounds of him scrolling through his phone, completely disengaged from the wife fighting for her life. And then about 2 weeks after the accident, everything changed. Ryan brought someone else into my hospital room. This is where they're keeping her, Ryan said. His voice had a different quality than I'd ever heard before, a coldness completely devoid of the warmth he typically affected. Is it safe for me to be here? A woman's voice unfamiliar to me, young with a slight Midwestern accent. Relax, Vanessa. The nurses know you from work. You're a concerned colleague visiting your friend. There was a long silence, then the sound of someone moving closer to my bed. She looks better than I expected, the woman, Vanessa, said. From how you described it, I thought she'd be more mangled, Ryan offered, with a soft, cruel laugh that made my consciousness recoil. The surgeons did good work on her face. Not that it matters now. How long have the doctors given her? Vanessa asked. They won't commit to a timeline. Keep talking about wait and see. But between us, the brain damage is extensive. Even if she wakes up, she won't be the same Ivy. I felt a light touch on my hand. Unfamiliar fingers, not Ryan's. It's weird seeing her like this, Vanessa said. I've watched her from across the office for 2 years, and now... The revelation struck me like a physical blow. This woman worked at Ryan's firm. I'd probably seen her at company events, perhaps even exchanged pleasantries, never knowing she was involved with my husband. "How long have we been together now?" Ryan asked, and I could hear the smile in his voice. 2 years next month, Vanessa replied, a warmth in her tone that spoke of genuine affection. "Though sneaking around has gotten old. All those nights you had to go home to her instead of staying with me. 2 years. While I'd been working late supporting my mother and trying to be a good wife, Ryan had been building a parallel life with someone else. The betrayal was staggering, and yet I couldn't even cry, couldn't scream, couldn't confront them. I was imprisoned in my own body, forced to listen. "Those days are over now," Ryan said, his voice low and intimate. "One way or another." "What did the insurance company say?" Vanessa asked, her tone shifting to something more practical. Ryan sighed. "It's complicated. The primary life insurance would pay out $3 million if she dies. There's another policy through her work that's worth about half that. And if she wakes up, there's separate coverage for permanent disability, but it pays out over time rather than a lump sum. Harder to access, more oversight." The clinical way they discussed my life, or death, sent waves of horror through me. This wasn't just an affair. They were calculating the financial benefits of my death. "What about the property?" Vanessa asked. "The condo has to be worth at least $2 million in today's market," Ryan finished. "Plus her investment portfolio is close to $1 million. Once everything's settled, we're looking at around $6 to $7 million easy. Enough to disappear somewhere warm and live very, very well." But we have to wait," Vanessa said, a note of frustration in her voice. "Not necessarily," Ryan replied, his voice dropping even lower. "The doctors have made it clear she's not coming back. Not really. They're keeping her alive with machines and medications. It would be more merciful to let nature take its course." Cold terror washed over me as I understood what he was suggesting. My husband was not just waiting for me to die. He was contemplating helping the process along. "Ryan, we can't," Vanessa started, but he cut her off. "Of course not directly," he said. "But there are ways to help things along that look completely natural. A slight adjustment to her IV, an air bubble in the line, simple, untraceable, and a kindness, really." "I don't know about this," Vanessa said, but her objection sounded weak, performative rather than genuine. "Think about it," Ryan urged. "Another month of lying here while her body deteriorates, or a peaceful passing surrounded by her loved ones, then a tasteful funeral. I've been looking into options already." My consciousness screamed in a void no one could hear. They were discussing my murder as if it were a vacation plan. "What kind of funeral?" Vanessa asked, and I realized with horror that she was being drawn into his rationalization. "Something elegant. Closed casket, of course. Her parents would appreciate traditional touches, but nothing too religious. She wasn't particularly devout." "Would I attend?" Vanessa asked. "As my emotional support, naturally. A colleague who's helping me through this difficult time." The smirk was audible in his voice. "We'd need to wait an appropriate period before making our relationship public, of course. 6 months minimum." "And then?" Vanessa prompted. "And then we sell the condo, liquidate the investments, and start our real life together. I'm thinking a beachfront property in the Caymans. No extradition." They continued discussing their plans for my funeral and their future together, down to the flowers they'd choose and the island properties they'd consider purchasing with my insurance money. All while I lay there conscious, but unable to move so much as an eyelid. The conversation shifted when Ryan mentioned checking the hallway to ensure they weren't overheard. There was a pause, the sound of footsteps, and then the door opening and closing. Vanessa moved closer to my bed. "Nothing personal, Ivy," she whispered. "You have a great life. I just want it for myself." The door opened again as Ryan returned. "Coast is clear," he said, "but we should wrap this up before the nurse comes back. That one, Sophia, she watches me like a hawk." "When should we—" Vanessa trailed off. "Soon," Ryan answered. "I'll figure out the details. Just be ready to move quickly once it's done." I've already started transferring assets to offshore accounts. I felt the brush of his fingers against my cheek, a touch that once would have seemed loving, but now felt predatory. Just a little longer, and then this will all be over, he murmured, and I couldn't tell if he was speaking to me or to Vanessa. They were making their final plans when the door opened again. Excuse me, the voice was Sophia's, my day nurse. I need to check Mrs. Lawson's vitals and administer her medication. Of course, Ryan said, his voice instantly transforming into the concerned husband. This is Vanessa, a colleague from the firm. She wanted to pay her respects. Nice to meet you, Sophia said, though her tone carried no warmth. I'll need some privacy with my patient now. I heard them leave, the door closing behind them. Sophia moved around my bed, checking monitors, adjusting my IV. Then she leaned close to my ear. Mrs. Lawson, she whispered. I don't know if you can hear me, but if you can, I want you to know something. She paused, her voice dropping even lower. I heard everything, and I'm going to make sure they don't hurt you. For the first time since the accident, I felt something beyond fear and despair. Hope. After Ryan and Vanessa left, Sophia stayed by my bedside longer than usual for a routine check. I could sense her moving around the room, but her typical narration of care activities was replaced with an unusual silence. Finally, she leaned close to my ear again. Mrs. Lawson Ivy. I want you to know that I've been watching your husband for weeks now. Something about his behavior has felt off. Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if she feared being overheard despite the closed door. At first I thought it was just grief or shock. People react differently when loved ones are injured. But then I noticed how he changes when he thinks no one's watching. How he checks his phone constantly, but hides it when staff enter the room. How he never stays overnight, unlike most devoted spouses. I felt the gentle pressure of Sophia's hand on mine. I've been a neuro ICU nurse for 15 years. I've seen all kinds of family dynamics, all kinds of grief. What I just witnessed wasn't grief, it was calculation. She adjusted something near my bed, the IV line I guessed from the familiar sound of plastic tubing being manipulated. The doctors say your brain activity has been showing unusual patterns. Most coma patients have fairly consistent readings, but yours fluctuate when certain people are in the room, especially your husband. It made me wonder if on some level you might be able to hear what's happening around you. If only she knew how right she was. If only I could squeeze her hand, blink, make any sign to confirm her suspicions. But my body remained as unresponsive as ever, a prison containing my increasingly panicked mind. I'm going to help you, Sophia continued. First, I've activated the recording function on your room's monitoring system. It's typically only used for medical purposes to record unusual readings or events, but it captures audio as well as vitals. Everything they just said is preserved. I felt a rush of gratitude so intense it seemed impossible that it didn't manifest physically, a tear, a twitch, something. Second, I'm going to speak with hospital security about installing a small camera. I'll cite concerns about equipment tampering, which isn't entirely untrue given what I just heard. Her voice became even more hushed. Third, I'm reporting my concerns to Dr. Keller and to hospital administration. I don't know your husband, but threatening a vulnerable patient even obliquely triggers mandatory reporting protocols. I heard her straightening items on the bedside table, the water pitcher, the box of tissues kept for visitors. I'm going to make a note to change your care schedule too. From now on, you'll never be left alone when he visits. Either myself or another senior nurse will always be present or nearby. The soft squeak of her shoes indicated she was moving toward the door. Try to stay calm if you can hear me, Ivy. Stress can affect your recovery. I know that's easier said than done given what you just heard, but you're not alone anymore. I promise. After Sophia left, I existed in a strange limbo of terror and hope. My husband and his lover had essentially outlined a murder plot, but someone had heard them. Someone believed me capable of recovery. Someone was watching out for me. Hours passed, marked only by the steady beep of monitors and the routine sounds of a busy hospital floor carts being wheeled past my door distant announcements over the PA system, the murmur of conversations in the hallway. Later that afternoon, I heard the door open again and multiple people enter. Concerned about potential tampering with equipment or medication, Sophia was saying. Given the patient's vulnerable state and the unusual fluctuations in her readings, I believe additional monitoring would be prudent. I agree, came Dr. Keller's familiar voice. Mrs. Lawson's case is complex enough without introducing variables. Security, how quickly can we implement the additional measures? We can have a small camera installed within the hour, replied a deeper male voice I didn't recognize. It will feed directly to the nursing station and our security office. Standard protocol for high-risk patients. And you say you overheard the husband discussing her condition in concerning terms, Dr. Keller asked. Yes, Sophia replied firmly. He and a female visitor were discussing Mrs. Lawson's prognosis and financial matters in a way that raised immediate red flags. I've documented the conversation in my notes and activated the audio recording on the monitoring system. Good thinking, Dr. Keller said. Let's review that together after we finish here. In my experience, family members sometimes make inappropriate comments when processing grief, but it's always better to err on the side of caution. There was also mention of her life insurance policy, Sophia added. Substantial amounts from what I gathered. A thoughtful, from Dr. Keller. Security. Let's also implement restricted visitation. Family only, and never without medical staff present. What about the woman who was here earlier? She claimed to be a colleague, Sophia asked. Unless Mrs. Lawson's parents confirm she's a close family friend, she's restricted from visiting, Dr. Keller decided. And I want a detailed log of everyone who enters this room, regardless of their relationship to the patient. The conversation continued as they discussed the technical aspects of increasing security around my room. I felt a complex mixture of emotions: fear that Ryan might somehow circumvent these precautions, relief that I was being protected, and a desperate hope that someone might notice I was conscious beneath my unresponsive exterior. After they left, a period of activity followed, technicians installing equipment, security personnel checking the room, Sophia returning to adjust my position and speak reassuringly to me throughout. The camera is in place now, Ivy, she told me while changing my IV bag. It's small in the upper corner near the television. Your husband won't notice it unless he's specifically looking for surveillance equipment. She paused in her work. I reviewed the recording with Dr. Keller. He's disturbed by what he heard. The hospital has contacted Detective Martinez from the Chicago PD's Special Victims Unit. She specializes in cases involving vulnerable adults. The news that police were being involved sent a wave of relief through me. Surely now Ryan wouldn't be able to harm me. Surely his plot would be discovered and stopped. There's something else, Sophia said, her voice taking on an excited quality. Your latest EEG shows increasing brain activity, particularly when you're being spoken to directly. Dr. Keller is cautiously optimistic that you might be experiencing what's called covert consciousness awareness without the ability to respond. She squeezed my hand. If you can hear me, Ivy, we're going to try some tests tomorrow to see if we can establish communication. It won't be easy, but there are protocols for patients in your condition. For the first time since overhearing Ryan's murderous plans, I felt something beyond fear and desperate hope. I felt the possibility of rescue, of reclaiming my voice, of fighting back. That evening my parents visited. I could hear the fatigue in their voices, the strain of weeks spent between the hospital and their temporary accommodations nearby. She looks peaceful today, my mother said, stroking my hair. Do you think she's in pain, Richard? The doctors say no, my father replied. All her pain responses are being monitored. If she were experiencing discomfort, they would know. I just wish there was some way to know if she can hear us, my mother sighed. All these one-sided conversations, if only they knew. I was screaming inside, desperate to communicate, to warn them about Ryan, to tell them I was still here. They stayed for about an hour, updating me on extended family news, reading aloud from the Chicago Tribune, and finally saying reluctant goodbyes with promises to return in the morning. After they left, the hospital gradually quieted as night fell. The lighting in my room was dimmed, and the nursing staff transitioned to night shift. Sophia introduced me to the night nurse Elena before leaving. Remember what we discussed? Sophia told Elena cryptically. No one is to be alone with the patient, especially not the husband. Call security immediately if anything seems off. Understood, Elena replied. I've been briefed on the situation. The night hours stretched endlessly. Without visual stimulation, my world consisted solely of sounds and occasional touches, as Elena checked my vitals and adjusted my position to prevent bed sores. The monotony was broken only by my racing thoughts replaying Ryan and Vanessa's conversation, imagining scenarios where I might somehow communicate planning what I would do if when I recovered. It was during these quiet hours that I first noticed something extraordinary. While focusing intensely on trying to move my fingers, I felt or thought I felt the slightest twitch in my right index finger. It was so minimal, I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it a phantom sensation born of desperate hope. I concentrated again, pouring all my mental energy into that single finger, willing it to move. Nothing. But then on the third attempt it was again the faintest tremor of movement like a butterfly's wing against my consciousness. This tiny victory, imperceptible to anyone else, became my anchor through the long night. I practiced repeatedly fighting against the leaden weight of my unresponsive body, sometimes succeeding in producing that minuscule movement, often failing. By morning, exhaustion had claimed me, and I drifted into a deeper unconsciousness. When I became aware again, Sophia had returned, and she wasn't alone. "This is Detective Martinez," she was saying. "She's here about the concerns we discussed yesterday." "Ms. Thompson," a new voice said, professional with a subtle Latina accent. "I've reviewed the audio recording from Mrs. Lawson's room and the nurse's report. I'd like to discuss implementing a more comprehensive surveillance strategy." What followed was a detailed conversation about legal requirements for recording in hospital settings, patient privacy laws, and exceptions for suspected criminal activity against vulnerable individuals. "The hospital's legal team has approved our plan." Dr. Keller's voice joined the discussion. "Given the nature of the threat, and Mrs. Lawson's inability to protect herself, we have both ethical and legal grounds to proceed." "Good," Detective Martinez responded. "My team will take it from here. We'll need to know immediately when the husband plans his next visit." "He typically comes in the early evening," Sophia supplied. "Around 6. Claims it's after work, but he rarely stays longer than 30 minutes. "Perfect," the detective said. "We'll have everything in place by then. In the meantime, I'd like to interview the parents discreetly. They might have insights into the husband's behavior or financial situation that could be relevant." They continued discussing logistics while I processed this new development. Police involvement meant Ryan's threat was being taken seriously, but it also meant confrontation was inevitable. What would happen when Ryan realized he was being watched? Would he abandon his plan or become more desperate? As the day progressed, various medical professionals came and went. Dr. Keller conducted a detailed neurological examination, paying particular attention to my reflexes and responses to stimuli. "Interesting," he murmured at one point. "Nurse Thompson, are you seeing this? There's definite finger movement in response to pain stimulus." "That's new," Sophia confirmed, excitement in her voice. "Let's run another EEG," Dr. Keller ordered, "and schedule an fMRI for tomorrow. If we're seeing intentional movement, however minimal, it changes her prognosis significantly." The remainder of the day passed in a blur of tests, specialist consultations, and careful preparation. Medical staff positioned recording devices discreetly around my room. Security protocols were reviewed. Everyone spoke in hushed, focused tones about the operation and maintaining normal appearances. Through it all, I continued my private battle, concentrating on moving that single finger whenever I had the energy. Occasionally I succeeded, though no one seemed to notice these tiny victories amidst the flurry of other activities. As 6 o'clock approached, tension in the room became palpable. Sophia adjusted my bedding and IV one last time. "Everything's ready, Ivy," she whispered. "Detective Martinez and her team are in place. Security is on standby. Dr. Keller is at the nurse's station monitoring your vitals." She squeezed my hand gently. "Whatever happens next, you're safe. I promise." She stepped back just as the door opened and Ryan's familiar footsteps entered the room. Evening, Mr. Lawson. Sophia greeted him with professional courtesy that betrayed none of her knowledge. Nurse Thompson, Ryan acknowledged. How is she today? Stable, Sophia replied. Dr. Keller noted some interesting readings on her last EEG. He's cautiously optimistic. Is he? Ryan's voice carried forced interest. That's good news. I need to check on another patient, Sophia said. I'll be back in a few minutes to administer her evening medications. Take your time, Ryan replied smoothly. I'd appreciate some private moments with my wife. The door closed, but I knew Sophia hadn't really left. She would be watching from the monitoring station, along with Detective Martinez and her team. Ryan was being observed, recorded, his every move scrutinized. He moved closer to my bed, and I felt his hand on mine, the same hand where my index finger had shown that precious glimmer of movement. Hello, darling, he said, his voice syrupy with false concern. You're looking well today. I felt something being placed on the bedside table, something that hadn't been there before. I brought you some hand cream, he continued conversationally. The nurse mentioned your skin is getting dry from the hospital air. There was a pause, then the sound of a text message arriving on his phone. He checked it, the soft glow briefly illuminating my closed eyelids. Vanessa sends her best, he said softly, menacingly. She's very concerned about your comfort. I heard him open what must have been the hand cream container, but instead of the expected scent of lotion, there was a faint medicinal smell. The doctors say you might be showing signs of awareness, Ryan continued, his voice still casual. We can't have that, can we? Fortunately. I've brought something to help you rest more peacefully. I felt him lift my hand, the one connected to the IV. Horror flooded through me as I realized what was happening. He was planning to inject something into my IV line, something brought under the guise of hand cream. With every ounce of will and desperation, I focused on my finger, the one that had moved before. Move. Move. And it did. A definite twitch stronger than before. Ryan froze. What the? The door burst open. She's awake and recording. Sophia's voice rang out clearly, triumphantly. Chaos erupted. Security personnel rushed in. Detective Martinez identified herself. Ryan protested, claimed a misunderstanding. The hand cream was seized as evidence. Through it all, I kept moving my finger, the only voice I had, my only way of testifying to my own consciousness, my only method of fighting back against the husband who had planned to murder me. Look, Sophia exclaimed. Her finger is moving deliberately. She can hear us. She's responding. In that moment, as Ryan was led away in handcuffs, still protesting his innocence, I knew I had survived not just a devastating accident, but an even more devastating betrayal. And somewhere deep inside, I found the strength to begin the long journey back to full consciousness. The days following Ryan's arrest passed in a blur of heightened medical attention and police activity. Detective Martinez and her team established a regular presence at the hospital, coordinating with medical staff and collecting evidence. The substance Ryan had attempted to introduce into my IV was analyzed and found to contain a lethal dose of potassium chloride, a compound that would have stopped my heart and appeared as natural cardiac arrest in someone with my injuries. Vanessa was brought in for questioning the same night, and faced with the recorded evidence of their conversation, quickly turned on Ryan in exchange for a plea deal. She provided investigators with details of their 2-year affair and revealed Ryan's elaborate planning, including his research into untraceable poisons and his offshore financial arrangements. My parents were devastated by the revelations. I could hear the shock and betrayal in their voices when they visited, though they tried to maintain optimistic conversations at my bedside, clearly guided by Dr. Keller's advice to keep stress levels around me minimal. We never trusted him completely, my father admitted during one visit, his voice heavy with regret. There was always something too perfect, too calculated about him. But we never imagined. The detective says they've frozen all your accounts, my mother added. Ryan can't access anything now. They're bringing in forensic accountants to trace what he's already taken. Megan visited daily, often bringing fresh flowers or reading aloud from my favorite books. During one visit, she revealed something that explained her cryptic airport text. I should have told you sooner, she said, her voice thick with guilt. 3 weeks before your accident, I saw Ryan with Vanessa at a restaurant in Evanston. They were intimate, unmistakably so. I took photos intending to show you, but I couldn't bring myself to hurt you that way without absolute proof. I was investigating, trying to gather more evidence when your accident happened. She paused, and I heard her tearful intake of breath. When you texted about surprising him for your anniversary, I panicked. That's why I asked you to call me. But then everything happened so fast. If I'd just told you immediately, maybe none of this would have— Ms. Porter, please, Sophia interjected gently. Remember what Dr. Keller said about keeping conversations positive. Ivy can hear you, and stress could impede her recovery. Through all of this, my medical condition was showing promising changes. The finger movement that had saved my life became more consistent, and within days, I could reliably move my index finger in response to yes/no questions. 1 twitch for yes, 2 for no. This simple communication method became my lifeline to the outside world. Dr. Keller conducted comprehensive neurological assessments daily, documenting my increasing responsiveness. The brain is remarkable, he explained during rounds, speaking to the medical students who sometimes accompanied him. Mrs. Lawson's case demonstrates locked-in syndrome with partial recovery potential. Her consciousness is intact, but the connection between brain and body was severely compromised by the trauma. I learned medical terms for my condition through these teaching sessions. My traumatic brain injury had damaged my brainstem, but spared higher cognitive functions. I was neither in a vegetative state nor fully comatose, but rather trapped in a body that wouldn't respond to my conscious commands. 2 weeks after Ryan's arrest, I achieved another milestone. I opened my eyes voluntarily for the first time since the accident. The world appeared blurry, distorted, but it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Sophia was at my bedside when it happened, and her joyful reaction brought tears to both our eyes, mine now visible evidence of my emotions. Progress continued steadily if slowly. Eye movement became more controlled. I could blink intentionally, another communication method more nuanced than finger twitches. A speech therapist introduced a letter board where I could select letters by looking at them, gradually spelling out words in simple sentences. My first communicated message was for Sophia ThankyoU. Her eyes filled with tears. You're welcome, Ivy. I was just doing my job. My second message was for Detective Martinez Heplanedit. We know, she assured me, and we have enough evidence to put him away for a very long time. The recording, the poison Vanessa's testimony, the financial transactions, it's an airtight case. Recovery was not linear. Some days brought noticeable improvements. Others left me frustrated by limitations or setbacks. The physical therapy was grueling. Exercises to maintain muscle tone, prevent atrophy, and eventually retrain basic functions. The occupational therapy was equally challenging, learning to perform simple tasks that had once been automatic. 3 months after the accident, I spoke my first word, a raspy, barely audible mom, that nevertheless reduced my mother to joyful tears. By month 4, I could form short sentences, though my voice remained weak and my articulation imprecise. Breathing independently was another milestone. The ventilator that had sustained me was gradually reduced and finally removed entirely, allowing me to feel the simple pleasure of drawing breath on my own. Motor function returned asymmetrically. My right side responded better to therapy than my left, which had sustained more direct trauma in the crash. Walking would require extensive rehabilitation and initially assistive devices. Through it all, the legal proceedings against Ryan continued in parallel with my recovery. Grand jury indictments, preliminary hearings, evidence reviews. Detective Martinez kept me updated, visiting regularly, to document my improving ability to communicate and prepare me for eventually testifying. He's claiming diminished capacity, she told me during one visit 6 months after the accident. Says the stress of your injury affected his judgment. Nobody's buying it, especially with the evidence of premeditation. I had progressed enough by then to respond verbally. He researched poisons before my accident. Detective Martinez looked up sharply. What do you mean? With careful, deliberate speech, I explained finding searches for untraceable poisons and natural-looking heart failure in our shared tablet's history months before the crash. I dismissed it at the time, assuming it was research for a thriller novel Ryan claimed to be writing. This new information led to additional warrants uncovering Ryan's extensive planning dating back nearly a year before my accident. The prosecution's case strengthened further. 7 months after the accident, I was transferred from the hospital to an intensive rehabilitation facility. The day of my transfer, Sophia accompanied me to the ambulance. I requested a special assignment, she told me with a smile. I'll be consulting with the rehab facility's nursing staff once a week on your case. I'm not abandoning you yet. My voice was stronger now, though still affected by lingering nerve damage. You saved my life. Twice. She squeezed my hand. You saved yourself, Ivy. That finger movement, that was all you. At the rehabilitation center, my recovery accelerated. Daily physical therapy sessions built strength and coordination. Speech therapy helped me regain more natural patterns of speech and expression. Occupational therapy taught me adaptive techniques for daily activities still beyond my physical capabilities. Megan visited almost daily, often bringing work materials to keep me connected to the marketing world. Your job is still waiting, she assured me. The company has been incredibly supportive. They're legally required to hold your position for a year, but the CEO said they'll extend that indefinitely. My parents divided their time between the rehabilitation center and meeting with financial advisors. Ryan's actions had created a complex legal and financial situation that required extensive untangling. The good news, my father reported, is that he hadn't managed to transfer most of the assets before he was caught. The accounts he did access have been frozen pending the criminal case outcome. Through this period, my emotional recovery progressed alongside the physical. A trauma therapist helped me process not just the accident, but the profound betrayal by the man I had trusted most. Some days anger dominated. Rage at Ryan's calculated deception at the years of my life invested in a relationship that had been a lie. Other days brought overwhelming grief for the life and marriage I'd thought I had. Your emotions are valid, my therapist reminded me, and feeling them fully is part of healing. The path forward isn't about forgetting what happened, but about integrating it into your life story without allowing it to define you. 9 months after the accident, I faced Ryan in court for the first time. I had practiced for this moment extensively with both Detective Martinez and the prosecuting attorney, but nothing could fully prepare me for seeing him again. I entered the courtroom in a wheelchair, still unable to walk unassisted for long distances. My speech had improved dramatically, but remained slightly slurred under stress. The prosecutor had prepared the judge and jury for my condition, explaining that it resulted directly from the injuries Ryan had attempted to exploit. As I was sworn in, Ryan's eyes met mine. The man who had once been my husband, whom I had trusted completely, showed no remorse, only cold calculation as he evaluated my impaired condition. My testimony was delivered slowly, clearly, with deliberate pauses to manage my still recovering speech patterns. I described our marriage, the gradual emergence of concerning behaviors, and most critically, what I had heard while seemingly unconscious. He said, it would be more merciful to let nature take its course. I testified, my voice steady despite the emotion behind the words. Then he discussed ways to help things along that would look natural. An air bubble in the IV line. He said it would be simple, untraceable. Ryan's attorney attempted to discredit my testimony, suggesting that my brain injury might have caused me to confuse dreams or hallucinations with reality. The prosecutor countered with expert witnesses who explained locked-in syndrome and covert consciousness, and with the damning audio recordings that corroborated my account. When the verdict came 3 weeks later, guilty on all counts including attempted murder, conspiracy, and financial fraud, I felt not triumph, but a complex mixture of relief, vindication, and profound sadness. The judge's sentencing statement was unambiguous in its condemnation, Mr. Lawson, you exploited your position of trust to plan the murder of your incapacitated wife for financial gain. This court sentences you to 25 years in state prison without possibility of parole for 10 years. As Ryan was led away, I realized this chapter of my life was closing. The man who had planned my death would spend decades behind bars. The woman who had conspired with him had received a reduced sentence in exchange for her testimony, but would still serve 7 years. I had survived not just a catastrophic accident, but an elaborate murder plot. And somehow, against all odds, I was rebuilding my life. 1 year after the accident that nearly claimed my life, I walked into my welcome back party at the marketing firm using only a cane for support. Colleagues who had known me as a dynamic executive before the crash applauded as I made my careful way to the center of the room where the CEO waited with a champagne toast. "To Ivy," he announced, raising his glass, "whose determination and courage remind us all what true strength looks like." My return to work was initially part-time 3 days a week, with accommodations for my ongoing recovery. My speech had improved to near normal, though I still struggled with complex presentations and sometimes needed to pause to find words. My left side remained weaker than my right, necessitating the cane and occasional rest periods. But my cognitive abilities had returned fully. If anything, my analytical skills seemed sharper, my creative problem-solving more intuitive. Perhaps facing death twice had recalibrated my brain to focus on what truly mattered. The criminal case against Ryan had concluded, but civil proceedings continued. My attorney, Caroline Winters, specialized in complex financial recovery cases and had methodically traced Ryan's attempts to hide assets. "We've recovered approximately 80% of what he diverted," she reported during one of our regular meetings. The offshore accounts were trickier, but the criminal conviction gave us leverage with international banking authorities. There's still the question of the condo and other joint assets, but the courts have been consistently ruling in your favor given the circumstances. The financial recovery was important. Ryan had systematically depleted our savings over the 2 years of his affair with Vanessa, but what mattered more was reclaiming my independence. The insurance settlement from the accident covered my substantial medical expenses and ongoing rehabilitation, allowing me to focus on healing rather than financial stress. My parents had returned to their respective homes, though they visited regularly. My mother's Parkinson's required her own medical attention, and caring for me had delayed her treatment. Now we compared notes on physical therapy techniques, finding unexpected humor in our shared challenges. My relationship with Sophia evolved from nurse-patient to genuine friendship. She had been instrumental in my recovery not just by saving my life that critical day, but by advocating for me throughout my hospital stay. We met monthly for coffee, and she took particular pride in each milestone of my recovery. "I've been a nurse for 15 years, she told me during one of these coffee dates, "but your case changed how I practice medicine. I pay much more attention to patients who appear unconscious now, always assuming they might hear and understand more than we realize." Her insights led to a collaboration that would eventually change hospital protocols. Together with Dr. Keller, we developed a program to train medical staff on detecting and communicating with patients experiencing covert consciousness. What began as presentations at Chicago Memorial expanded to regional medical conferences and eventually national healthcare forums. 18 months after the accident, I delivered my first public speech about my experience at a neurological rehabilitation symposium. My voice still carried a slight rasp, and I needed to sit rather than stand at the podium. But the audience of medical professionals listened intently as I described what it had been like to be conscious yet unable to communicate. "The isolation is absolute," I told them. "Imagine being at a party where everyone talks about you but not to you, where critical decisions about your life are made without your input, where you scream but no one hears. That is locked-in syndrome." The speech led to media attention which I initially hesitated to embrace. My story, the accident. Ryan's betrayal and murder attempt, my remarkable recovery, had all the elements of sensational journalism. But Detective Martinez encouraged me to consider the public benefit. "Your experience could save lives," she pointed out. There are other vulnerable patients out there, other people in similar situations. Your voice matters. So I began speaking selectively to trusted journalists, always emphasizing the medical aspects and the importance of patient advocacy rather than the true crime elements that some outlets preferred to highlight. I established a foundation focused on research and support for patients with disorders of consciousness, funding it partially with proceeds from the eventual sale of the condo I had once shared with Ryan. 2 years after the accident, I moved into a single-story home specifically designed to accommodate my lingering mobility challenges. The house featured wider doorways, accessible bathrooms, and a garden designed for both beauty and therapeutic exercise. It was here that I truly began to feel I was building a new life rather than just recovering what had been lost. Dating again seemed impossible at first. The trauma of Ryan's betrayal had left deep scars, and my physical limitations made me self-conscious. But at Megan's persistent encouragement, I eventually agreed to meet her colleague David for coffee. David was a graphic designer who had recently recovered from his own health crisis, a rare autoimmune disorder that had temporarily left him unable to use his hands, his primary tools as an artist. Perhaps it was this shared experience of physical limitation and recovery that created our initial connection. The hardest part wasn't the pain, he told me during that first meeting. It was the uncertainty, not knowing if I'd ever draw again, if I'd have to reinvent my entire identity. I nodded, understanding completely. For me, it was the silence, having thoughts but no way to express them. Our relationship progressed slowly, deliberately. I was transparent about my traumatic history, my ongoing recovery, and my trust issues. He was patient, never pushing for more than I was ready to give. 6 months into dating, when he first stayed the night, I woke panicking from a nightmare about Ryan. Instead of being frightened away, David simply held me until the terror subsided. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised, "unless you want me to." 3 years after the accident, I was promoted to Senior Vice President of Creative Strategy at my firm, a position created specifically to leverage my strategic thinking while accommodating my reduced capacity for travel and long hours. My team developed award-winning campaigns for clients ranging from healthcare organizations to technology startups, often focusing on inclusive messaging and authentic representation. I still attended physical therapy twice weekly, still used a cane when fatigue set in, still occasionally struggled to find words when tired. But these limitations no longer defined me. They were simply aspects of a life that had become rich and meaningful in ways I couldn't have imagined during those dark days in the hospital. On the 4th anniversary of the accident, I received a letter from the prison where Ryan was serving his sentence. My hands shook as I recognized his handwriting on the envelope. After consultation with my therapist, I decided to read it, needing to know whether it contained threats or remorse. The letter was neither. It was a clinical, almost academic analysis of his actions, framing them as mistakes made under financial pressure and emotional strain. He expressed no genuine regret for the harm he'd caused, only for the consequences he now faced. The final paragraph included a request for me to support his upcoming parole hearing. I showed the letter to Detective Martinez, who had become another close friend during our monthly lunch meeting. "Classic sociopathic behavior," she commented after reading it. "He still doesn't see you as fully human, just as an obstacle first, and now potentially a tool for his benefit." I nodded, having reached the same conclusion. "I'll be at the parole hearing, but not to support his release." When that hearing came 6 months later, I delivered a victim impact statement that detailed not just the physical and emotional trauma I had endured, but the calculated nature of Ryan's betrayal. I described hearing him plan my murder while lying helpless and the years of recovery that followed. "The defendant has expressed no genuine remorse," I told the parole board. "His recent communication with me demonstrates continued manipulation rather than reflection or rehabilitation. He remains a danger to me and potentially to others." The board denied Ryan's request for early parole. 5 years after the accident, I published a memoir titled "Hearing Everything: My Journey from Silence to Strength." The book detailed my experience with locked-in syndrome, the attempted murder, and my recovery journey. Rather than sensationalizing the crime aspects, I focused on the medical realities of traumatic brain injury and the power of human resilience. The book became a surprising bestseller, leading to a nationwide speaking tour where I addressed medical conferences, university classes, and support groups for brain injury survivors. Though physically taxing, the tour allowed me to connect with others who had experienced similar trauma and isolation. At a speaking event in Milwaukee, I noticed an elderly couple in the front row, the woman using a walker decorated with colorful ribbons. After my presentation, they approached slowly. "You've given us hope," the man said, eyes glistening. "Our daughter has been in a minimally conscious state for 3 years. After hearing you speak, we're going to request the advanced brain imaging you mentioned. Maybe she's in there like you were just waiting for the right technology to help her communicate." Such encounters reinforced my sense of purpose, the feeling that my traumatic experience could serve some greater good. The foundation I had established was now funding research into improved detection of covert consciousness and developing technologies to help locked-in patients communicate. 6 years after the accident that changed everything, David proposed during a private dinner at my home. The ring was nothing like the ostentatious diamond Ryan had given me. Instead, it featured a simple emerald, my birthstone, in a handcrafted setting David had designed himself. "I know trust doesn't come easily to you," he said, "and I know our life together will include ongoing medical challenges. But I love all of you, Ivy, your strength, your determination, your capacity for joy, despite everything you've endured." I said yes, but with conditions that reflected my hard-won wisdom, complete financial transparency, separate accounts alongside joint ones, and a prenuptial agreement that protected us both. David agreed without hesitation. "Whatever makes you feel secure," he said. "That's what matters to me." We married in a small ceremony in my accessible garden with Sophia as my maid of honor and Detective Martinez among the guests. My father walked me down the aisle slowly, both of us using canes but steadily. During the reception, I took a moment alone to reflect on the journey that had brought me to this point. From the accident that nearly claimed my life to the husband who plotted to finish what the crash had started, to the medical professionals and law enforcement officers who protected me, to the arduous path of recovery, each step had led me here to a life I could never have imagined during those silent days in the hospital. I still had limitations. I still sometimes struggled with words when tired. I still needed accommodations for longer walks or extended standing. But I had also found strengths I never knew I possessed: resilience, determination, and a profound appreciation for the simple gift of communication. The nurse who had once whispered life-saving promises in my ear approached, champagne glass in hand. "Penny for your thoughts," Sophia said, joining me on the garden bench. "I was just thinking about that day," I replied. "When you told Ryan I was awake and recording, how did you know I could hear everything?" She smiled. "In 15 years of nursing, I've learned to trust my instincts. Your vital signs would change when certain people entered the room, especially Ryan. It was subtle but consistent. And then there was that finger movement." She shook her head, still amazed. "In that moment, I knew we were right to be suspicious. You gave me my voice back," I said simply. "And now I get to use it to help others." "That's the real victory," Sophia agreed. "Not just surviving, but transforming your experience into something meaningful." As David approached to claim a dance, one carefully choreographed to accommodate my balance issues, I realized that was indeed the truth at the heart of my story. I had not merely survived. I had reclaimed my voice, my autonomy, my future. And in doing so, I had found purpose in helping others do the same. Sometimes the most powerful transformations begin in our darkest moments. Mine began in a hospital room where a betrayal nearly ended my life, but instead launched my journey toward a deeper, more authentic way of living. Have you ever had that gut feeling something wasn't right but couldn't quite put it into words? Or has someone unexpected come through for you when you needed it most, like Sophia did for me? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this story touched you, please hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who might need to hear that. Even in our most vulnerable moments, we're never truly powerless. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, sometimes our greatest strength emerges when we think we have none left.